Since the introduction of South Africa as part of the British Tree, War Thunder has opened the door to smaller nations being inserted as subtrees within the tech tree of certain nations. Among these smaller nations is South Korea. South Korean vehicles have been a big question on players' minds. How could it not? South Korea has made very interesting vehicles in the modern era, such as the K1 and K2 Black Panther. In this video, we'll see what new vehicles Japan will receive when the South Korean tree gets added into the Japanese tech tree. We'll do this by tier, starting with tanks before aviation. I will include vehicles that were used by the US Forces Korea during the Korean War, unless it was specifically handed over in significant numbers to the Republic of Korea Army. Like Israel, the modern-day Republic of Korea was formed after World War II. It wouldn't be until the Korean War that the Republic of Korea Army would receive its first armored vehicles. While a majority of the vehicles Korea received already exist in the Japanese tech tree, there is one that Korea received in large numbers that Japan did not, the M36 Jackson. About 200 went into service with the Republic of Korea Army in 1950. In this tech tree, the M36 could add a much-needed boost in the 5.7 lineup of Japan that's sorely lacking. Comprised only of the M4A376W HVSS Sherman, the second 5.7 vehicle, though American, is welcome. Unfortunately, as the M47 Patton is already in the Japanese tree, Tier 5 South Korea would be represented by the M48 Patton. To pad out the trees, it can come in two variants, the M48A1 Patton, an easy copy from the US tree, and the M48A3K. The M48A3K differed from the A1 by being the M48A3 Mod A standard with a laser rangefinder, while retaining the 90mm M41 gun. The shells are mostly the same, though I don't think the T142E3 Hesh shell was exported to Korea. For originality's sake, I recommend skipping the M163 VADs and going straight to the K263, which is the same gun system but mounted on the K200 chassis. Feels more original and less copy-paste than the KM163 in Korean colors. The Korean tank line goes into Tier 6 with the M48A5K2 with a redesigned cupola, laser rangefinder, and the KM68A1 105mm gun, and more prominent side skirts. The M48A5K can use the K270 AFSDS, which performs a bit less than the Japanese Type 93 shell. Then there is the Korean BMP-3. We all know the Russian, South Korean arms deals in the 90s, and the BMP-3 was one of those. To really pad out the trees, there could be the BMP-3F variant. While the highlight of this variant is improved amphibious capability, in the Korean line, it can pad out the Tier 6 line by introducing a lower rating BMP-3 with no thermal sights, followed by the BMP-3M that is a copy-paste of the BMP-3 in the USSR tree. This would be followed by the K-21 IFV. As the ATGM launchers are still planned, it fulfills a role similar to the Stridsfordon 9040C and with a gun similar to it. It could fill the battle rating, same as the Stridsfordon 9040C. I would also like to talk about the K200 prototypes that were in various configurations that never made it into service. Those could be in between some tanks at the IFV line just to pad out the Tier 6 lineup. So before we hit the K188 tank, as we're on the MBTs, let's go over a few Tier 6 premiums first. One is the T-62. Korea ordered a Tyran 6 from Israel and used it in aggressor trial similar to the next premium, the T-72M1. Used similarly to the Tyran 6, the T-72M1 is roughly the T-72A in the USSR tree, but without the 1983 modification. And now, onto the pièce de résistance of the Korean Army, the K1-88 tank. The K1-88 is Korea's first indigenously built tank. Featuring a license-built American gun, the KM68A1, a German MTU-MB KA501 engine, a German transmission, and an American gunner's primary tank thermal sight. The armor is reportedly similar to the Chobham, and I don't think that's not far off considering how close the development of the tanks are. I think the K1 can emit the K270 shell and go straight for the K274 and K274N APFSDS rounds with a K277 heat shell stock. Around 450mm of pen for the K274 and roughly 500mm of pen for the K270, the K188 can occupy the 10.0 battle rating spot, same as the US M1 Abrams. There could also be a lower BR variant of the first K1 batch without the thermals on the gunner's primary tank sight. This could at least mitigate the 9.0 to 10.7 leap of the Japanese tree by introducing a lineup in the K21 and K188 at 10.0. Tier 7 is when things get interesting. Directly following the K188 is the K1A1. Upgrading to the KM256, it now uses the K276 shell and 650mm of pen. With the shell performing like the MA29A1 and the armor of an M1A1 with extra armor dubbed the Korean Special Armor Plate, the K1A1 could sit at 10.7 like the M1A1 HC. Before we hit the K2 Black Panther, I'd like to address the Korean TADU. While I understand that the TADU is a significant part of the armored force of Korea, I also can't find a place for it at Tier 7. Potentially, it could be in between the K188 and K1A1, but definitely it can't be a premium because it was fielded in large numbers. It will also sit at 10.7 and use the same shells as the TADU in the Russian tree. Now for the K2 Black Panther. Using the newer K279 APFSDS with a reported pen of 700mm and the K280 Heat MP with a pen of around 650mm using an L55 gun on a Bustle autoloader, the K2 would be at the peak of the South Korean line. While it would perform like a Leclerc Series 21 with an L55 gun, there are features I'd love to see, such as the legal aimbot lock-on function of the radar. RWR, LWS, and rangefinder is standard on the K2, which would actually make it a proper 11.3 tank. And now, we go to aviation. The Republic of Korea Air Force started out in 1949 when the United States handed out L-4 Grasshopper observational aircraft. But that is not the focus for today. Unless Gaijin decides to add stuff like the T-6 Trojan, the only vehicle that can supplant the Japanese tree is the P-51 D-20 Mustang. I don't think an explanation is needed, as it's present in like 3 separate trees now. For Tier 5, there are 2 Korean vehicles I have in mind, but since the F-86 F-30 is already in this tree, we talk about the A-37 Dragonfly instead. The A-37 Dragonfly is a perfect 6.7 strike fighter to fill the role that the R2Y2 and Kika, but at a larger scale. Fitted with a 7.62 minigun on the nose and provisions for gun pods under the wings, the A-37 can mount rockets and bombs. It can mount the LAU-3-19 rocket pod for the F-FAR and bombs from 250 to 750 pounds. It tops out at 816 kilometers per hour, so it's not any better than most Tier 5 aircraft. While I know that the F-5A in the Chinese tree is a Tier 7, in the US tree is a Tier 6 along with the F-4C. To that end, I'd like to add the F-5A and F-4D for Tier 6 in Japan. The F-5A is, well, an F-5A, and the F-4D is an F-4C with improved radar. Both aircraft can still use the AIM-9B and AIM-9E, and the F-4D can use the AIM-7D Sparrow like the F-4C. For Tier 7, I would probably not include the F-4E, as it provides little difference from the EJ other than Maverick capability. However, it could receive the F-5E that went into service with the ROKAF in 1974. They could be distinct from the KF-5E, with the KF-5E receiving AIM-9P for all-aspect missiles. Along with this, there also exists a fighter conversion of the Kai T-50 trainer known as the FA-50. Performing about the same as the F-5E in terms of speed, it's a step up in terms of armament, replacing the twin 20mm on the nose with a 3-barrel rotary gun. It also has Maverick capability, paveway capability, and, in the case of the upcoming Block 20 upgrades, AMRAAM capability. It would fit at top tier currently, as the Kai T-50 could fire AIM-9Ls, so that would be a nice end to the current vehicles that can be added. Now let's squeeze in the generation fighters here, since Tier 8 isn't confirmed yet, and I'm probably sure that they'll pad the Generation 4 fighters before moving them up to Tier 8. In this regard, Korea will have to wait a bit, as the first variant of the F-16 that the ROKAF acquired was the F-16C and D Block 32. The F-16C Block 32 would be good complements for the coming F-15J and F-15J Kai fighters Japan will get while waiting for the Mitsubishi F-2. Then, after the Block 32 would be the F-16C Block 52, which would be a separate vehicle from the KF-16, which are F-16 Block 52s locally produced by Kai. This is to create an extra vehicle from the upgrades the KF-16s are undergoing until 2025. This includes a new AESA radar, the Raytheon Advanced Next Generation Radar, or Ranger. But I don't think we'll see AESA radar in the immediate future, so with any luck, we might actually see the KF-16 upgrades complete before we see them in War Thunder. But that's where I'll end it. I'm not going to talk about the KF-21 just yet. We're not at that point, so I'll end it here. Overall, I think the Korean tree adds a much needed boost in areas Japan lacks in, but at the same time it eclipses Japan in some places. It's not my place to say whether it should or should not be added, as I would just grind them out as well for completion, like I'm doing with Israel now. Of course, notwithstanding the political implications of Japan and Korea sharing a tree, which should not ever be a thing in a video game, well, that is what I think. What do you think? I would love to hear your suggestions and comments. This is the Dr. MD. Godspeed.